Okay, we're closing out our lecture 16 on neuromuscular disorders with disorders that impact the neuromuscular junction. So as we review the neuromuscular junction, let's remember we have an action potential traveling down the axon of the lower motor neuron. So that action potential with sodium gates opening and then the potassium gates opening, that whole thing. And then when that action potential arrives, voltage-gated calcium channels open, which allows calcium to move into the cell because it's moving down its electrochemical gradient. That is going to cause the snare complex to be able to bring those synaptic vesicles to the plasma membrane where they will fuse and exocytose their neurotransmitter. In the case of the neuromuscular junction, that is acetylcholine. So the synaptic vesicles release acetylcholine, and then that is going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to those nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, the natchers, and which are themselves ionotropic receptors. So they are basically ligand-gated ion channels. So they will then open and let sodium into the muscle cell, which will then depolarize the muscle cell, which results in a muscle contraction. And we also need to end the signal. So we have an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which will take that acetylcholine molecule and break it down into its subparts, and therefore it can no longer bind and the signal will end. So that's the neuromuscular junction. The first disorder we're going to talk about is myasthenia gravis. This is an autoimmune condition. Autoimmune means that your immune system attacks yourself. Auto means self. It's obviously an abnormal response, but there's several different autoimmune conditions actually. And in this one, the body makes antibodies that block the acetylcholine receptor. So what you can see in this diagram over here on the left is these little green guys are the antibodies, and they bind to and then block the acetylcholine receptor so that acetylcholine can no longer bind to it. So if acetylcholine can't bind to the receptor because it's being blocked by the antibody, then you can't trigger all of those responses that would normally happen in the muscle cell. So you're releasing acetylcholine just fine, but it can't bind to the receptor. So as far as the muscle cell is concerned, there's no acetylcholine there. So this will cause fluctuating weakness of the skeletal muscles. Interestingly, it kind of waxes and wanes. The symptoms often get worse with prolonged use of a muscle. So like cutting vegetables for dinner, you might start out okay, but then as you keep going, it gets harder and harder. And in general, this condition isn't always fatal, and people who have it can have a near normal life expectancy. However, as I said, it can kind of fluctuate and things can flare up. And if one of the muscles that it impacts is your diaphragm, it can actually cause a life-threatening crisis. So if you get weakness of the muscles of respiration, primarily your diaphragm, that can be very dangerous. Now, notice here, this is a problem of the lower motor neuron being able to communicate with the muscle cell. So we're going to see a lower motor neuron syndrome here, where we see that decreased tone, decreased reflexes, that flaccid paralysis or weakness. So the treatment for myasthenia gravis is interesting. One of the treatments is medicines that are called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. So remember, acetylcholinesterase is the enzyme that normally breaks down acetylcholine. So if we inhibit those, that means acetylcholine isn't getting broken down as readily and it stays in the synapse longer. So the thinking is that not all of the receptors are being blocked at any one time, and by allowing the acetylcholine to stay in the synapse longer, it's more likely to be able to find an unblocked receptor to bind to. So that can absolutely help compensate and help with symptoms. There are also, since this is an autoimmune disease, there are also immune therapies of variety of various sorts that are used to treat this condition as well. So again, folks with this condition have a near normal life expectancy, but it does require lifelong treatment and supportive therapies, which thankfully we have, right? So we have things that can be really helpful and allow people to live a pretty good quality of life. Next condition I want to talk about is botulism. So what is this? So there's a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum that is a bacteria that normally lives in the soil. It lives in the dirt. And so it can get into lots of things because we dig in the dirt and do things in the dirt all the time. We grow our food in the dirt, for example. Now, this toxin that the bacteria makes moves into cells and inhibits the snare complex, which is so cool. So over here in A, this is the normal process, right? So I have my synaptic vesicle here in the axon terminal. When calcium moves into the cell, it's going to activate the snare complex. This protein is going to hook up with these, and they're going to pull the synaptic vesicle to the plasma membrane. It's going to fuse and release the neurotransmitter via exocytosis. In botulinum toxin, what happens is the toxin itself actually moves into the cell via endocytosis and interferes with the snare complex, right? So you can see, look, none of it works. So what happens is you can't release acetylcholine. The lower motor neuron is sending its action potential down. Voltage-gated calcium channels are opening. Calcium's rushing in, but it can't activate the snare complex, so you don't get any release of your neurotransmitter, which in this case is acetylcholine. So therefore, the muscle never gets the signal to contract. So how does somebody actually get botulism? So there are three main ways. One is if you eat improperly canned or preserved foods. So sometimes this bacterium is just in the food. It isn't easily killed by standard kind of cooking measures. So that's why if you're canning, you have to follow very specific and precise instructions to make sure you make it safe. And what can happen is if the bacterium is in this improperly canned food, that is an anaerobic environment, there's no air in there, and it will start to make the toxin. And then you go and eat that food and you ingest the toxin. So way number one to get botulism is that you directly ingest the toxin. The toxin itself is colorless, tasteless, and odorless, so you wouldn't necessarily know that you were ingesting it. The second way is wound contamination. So if you get this bacteria into a wound, especially a closed wound, kind of deep under your skin, then the bacteria can grow in that environment and start producing toxin inside your body. This is most commonly seen in people who use IV drugs, particularly in unsanitary, unclean environments. The third way you can get this, and this is the most common type of botulism that we see in the United States and in most Western and developed nations, is infant botulism. So infants are very interesting when they are first born. As we talked about with vitamin K, their intestines aren't populated with the normal bacteria yet. It takes them about a year or so to develop a mature, what we call a microbiome, the normal bacterial flora that live inside the intestines. So what happens is if an infant eats some of the bacteria, say they were playing in the dirt and they put their fingers in their mouth, or say it was in some honey, because interestingly, these spores of this bacteria are often found in honey because it's just, it's a natural product from outside. Then what can happen is the bacteria can grow inside their intestines because there are no other bacteria there to kind of keep it out. So they're very vulnerable to this. And then as the bacterium, the Clostridium botulinum bacterium, grows in their bodies, it can produce this toxin. So it's producing toxin as it's in their bodies and can cause paralysis. So again, I just want to reiterate that infants are particularly vulnerable to this because of their immature intestinal systems and the fact that this bacterium can make a home for itself inside their intestines, especially when they're very young. So not too long ago, there was an infant formula called By Heart that was contaminated with this bacterium, and there were infants all over the country who got ill with this condition. Many of them were in the ICU for extended lengths of time. Thankfully, we have treatment for botulism, but it was a big problem. I also want to take this moment to let you know that this is why pediatricians will say never to give honey to an infant. So never to any baby that is under 12 months of age. And that is because honey frequently has the spores of this bacterium. And it's fine for you and me. We have normal, healthy, mature GI tracts with lots of bacteria in them that won't give this bacteria a chance to get established. But in infants, they are vulnerable. So every pediatrician will tell you, do not give honey to an infant under 12 months of age. So what are the symptoms of botulism? Well, weakness and paralysis, right? If you cannot signal the muscle cells to contract, they're not going to contract. This is going to be a lower motor neuron syndrome. So you're not going to have increased tone, you're going to have decreased tone. And like anything that can cause paralysis, this can be fatal, right? Because if it paralyzes your diaphragm, then you're not breathing and you are not long for this world. Luckily, we have some antitoxin treatments and other things. So if people get rapid access to medical care, they typically survive, but not something you want to get regardless. So if you're home canning foods, make sure you follow appropriate procedures from well-vetted sources, not just a recipe that you saw from somebody's blog post, yeah? Make sure it's from like an extension office or a reputable source. So then you might be wondering, botulinum toxin, Botox. Yes. So Botox, which is used medically, often for aesthetic reasons, is locally administered botulinum toxin. So they actually extract the toxin, which is one of the most lethal poisons in the world, and they inject it just into specific muscles. Now, the thing about, we're like, why would they do that? It's because it is the contractions of the muscles in your face that causes wrinkles, right? So when I go like this and I get that big wrinkle, I go like this, I get wrinkles, right? But if you paralyze the muscles, then you don't get wrinkles. So you can see these kind of before and after pictures. When the muscles are paralyzed, then you don't have wrinkles. Now, this is often used for cosmetic purposes, but it actually has some important medical uses too. Sometimes, for example, in kids and individuals with cerebral palsy, they'll use it to help decrease that spasticity and decrease that resting tone by kind of paralyzing or relaxing the muscles, especially if it's causing problems. The last condition affecting the neuromuscular junction that we're going to talk about is organophosphate poisoning. So organophosphates are a class of molecules that are used as pesticides, and so they kill insects and things, and they're widely used. The way they work is they block acetylcholinesterase. So, like treatment for Graves' disease, but on a different order of magnitude, acetylcholine then is staying in the synapse. But you have healthy receptors in this situation, and so the acetylcholine never goes away, and so the muscles keep contracting because you've lost your ability to turn off the signal. So this can be fatal because you have continued contraction of all your skeletal muscles, including your diaphragm, which stays permanently contracted. So you take a breath in, which diaphragm contracts, and then you can't exhale. You can't relax it. And then, so it's fatal within minutes if you get a high enough dose. So be careful with pesticides. So in summary, disorders that affect the neuromuscular junction. Myasthenia gravis, which is the autoimmune disorder where the antibodies block the acetylcholine receptor, so the muscles can't get the signal. They can get fluctuating weakness, and it can be life-threatening if it affects the diaphragm. Botulism is due to that toxin produced by the Clostridium botulinum bacteria. And you can get it either as an adult, either ingestion of improperly canned or preserved food, which already has preformed toxin in it, or from a wound infection with the bacteria. But what we mostly see is infant botulism, where the bacteria is able to colonize their intestines and produce toxin from within their own bodies. And this is why we don't want you to give honey to any infant under 12 months of age. The way the toxin works is it prevents the snare complex from forming and pulling those synaptic vesicles so that they can fuse with the membrane, and acetylcholine can exocytose. So if you can't release acetylcholine, you cannot signal the muscle to contract. Then lastly, organophosphate poisoning. So these are pesticides that block the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. So this is the opposite problem. Acetylcholine is present and now we can't get rid of it. So once muscles are signaled to contract, they can then not stop contracting. All right, that's it for lecture 16. Thanks everyone.